Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, so I wanted to focus on an interesting short story that I read recently. Probably one of the better short stories that I read recently, as it really struck me. And it's a short story about racism and education. I am referring to Robert E. Lee is Dead by Danielle Evans, which comes from her short story collection, Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self, a good title, which was published in 2010. For those who don't know, Danielle Evans is an American author she's a fairly recent author. I say recent in that it appears that she's been getting her work published for the past 13 years. That seems more recent than, say, the year 2000, I guess. But she's been writing short stories as well as longer form stories. Don't know too much other information about her besides the fact that she went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is something that I've encountered quite a bit on Short Story Tuesday, as well as Poetry Thursday, and some of the authors that I've cataloged in on the books that I talk about for this channel. It appears that her blog hasn't been updated in quite a while. I don't know what that means, but I would be interested in reading more literature from her because I had a quality time with this short story collection, especially with Robert E. Lee is Dead. So without further ado, let's talk about this short story. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Robert E. Lee is Dead focuses on Crystal. She is a teenage girl, a high schooler. She is also a cheerleader and at a Southern high school. And that is significant because she is experiencing quite a bit of institutionalized racism because she is a young Black girl. And she befriends another young Black woman named Geena, who is way more popular than she is. Geena seems very protective of her for reasons that aren't quite clear, although I think it has something to do with the fact that Geena knows that Crystal has potential outside of this town that they live in, whereas perhaps Geena realizes that Geena doesn't have that as much potential. It's a bit unclear. But as I mentioned before, Crystal is experiencing a lot of institutionalized racism, including segregation. Despite the fact that desegregation took place a long time ago at the start of this story. It's the year 2000, so it's been about 30 or so years. Her school is still somewhat segregated, with the more well-to-do students and the students who can afford to study for standardized tests. They're being pushed to honors classes while all the other students, the minority students, are not in that. And then there's also the fact that much of the school the school district is trying to rezone things so that the Black students go to one school and the white students go to another. And that's not even, highlighting the other racism that takes place in this story, specifically with the fact that Crystal goes to Robert E. Lee High School, a predominantly minority school, being named after Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general. There's a problem right there. And at the start of this story, Crystal's school is gearing up for Rivalry Week, which Crystal notes is a bit ridiculous considering how new the other school is. So why would there be a rivalry already without there needing to be? But the school board notes that these students must certainly feel the passionate rivalry that takes place. And they just say that if any students are caught defacing another school's property, they will be that other school will be stripped of their funding in some way. And Crystal and her friends realize that there's nothing that says they can't, deface their own school property and blame it on the other school, which they do. They write slurs and they paint the other school's colors on the school doors. And in fact, that school is punished for the actions that they didn't really do. Nobody ever really finds out about that. And Geena and Crystal become tighter and closer as a result of that. Crystal helps Geena when she gets an abortion and covers for her with her family and whatnot. And Geena helps Crystal when it appears that Crystal attempts suicide. Crystal takes a lot of pills, and Geena helps her vomit and get over that apparent like a suicide attempt. And they seem to be really great friends through their years in high school. During the end of one year, Crystal is selected for a summer academy. Although the teacher who selects her, Crystal notes that teacher probably only did it because they wanted to make the school look racially inclusive. And so they selected a black student for this prestigious sort of university preparation event. This teacher probably wouldn't have selected her for anything of a similar sort otherwise. And this ends up producing a falling out with Geena because Geena believes that Crystal is putting on airs, and her friends note that Crystal is being bougie in that regard, and so they end up like kind of drifting apart for a little bit. But Crystal notes that although she is now alone again because she was already an outcast at the start of the story, being so focused on books. She's no longer lonely because being friends with Geena gave her a new boldness. And so she's able to stand up for herself and be okay with who she is now. Whereas Geena seems to be suffering because she relied so much on Crystal for academic help. Now she's not really getting that, and she ends up getting to a point where she's not able to graduate as a result. But eventually, Geena and Crystal both kind of become disillusioned with school, realizing that their peers are flaming out and realizing that there's not a whole lot available to them outside of high school, whether it be because they live in a poor area or because they're people of color and society has typically, oppressed those individuals. And eventually, there is a reunion where Geena and Crystal hang out, but Geena is unhappy still because she's not graduating and wishes the school would give her something as a token of, having attended there in the first place. And it doesn't seem like Geena actually wants to go for her GED, so who knows what is in store for her. But meanwhile, Crystal has been selected as the valedictorian, which is great for her. But she seems disillusioned with the school, and her and Geena decide to deface school, the graduation ceremony before it happens. This starts with them just spray painting "You're not as special as you think you are," but then Crystal actually signs her name to it, which alarms Geena. And in the process of trying to disguise it, Geena drops a cigarette that she's holding, and a massive fire starts, which threatens to burn down not only the ceremony but also the school. And as the story comes to a close and it sounds like the police are closing in, Geena tells Crystal to leave, which Crystal does, but as she's running away, she notes that a better person would have returned and helped Geena, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit to talk about with this story. Danielle Evans fills this with a lot of nuance and a lot of substance that you can pick apart. And I think this is one of those stories where you can examine it line by line. And sometimes a character's actions could mean one thing or it can mean multiple things. But one of the things that Danielle Evans seems to be talking about here is friendship, especially a friendship in a difficult time. Because Geena and Crystal do share a bond in an already stressful point in life where you're in high school and things aren't normally that easy. But they also seem to be going through some struggles. Geena had to go get an abortion, which certainly isn't easy. And Crystal seems to be having a tough time at home because her family is going through some financial trouble. And I think that might have something to do why she swallowed a bunch of pills. It might have something to do with the financial aspect of that. I think it might also be the pressure forced on her by society for her to do so well academically and get out of this situation that she's in. And it just leads her to I'm just going to kill myself so I won't have to deal with all of that. But Geena helps her through that and makes it so she doesn't actually die as a result. So they're both helping one another in this very stressful moment. And as a result, Crystal develops a new boldness, according to her. She's able to stand up for herself and be more comfortable with her outcast position in high school. However, I don't think that friendship I don't think it's equality of outcomes with this friendship, because Geena doesn't seem to be getting the same thing. Like once Crystal helps Geena with her homework, like she does well academically, but after they're falling out, Geena suffers, and it seems like Gina's not gonna be able to graduate, and so this friendship produces more for Crystal than it does for Geena, unfortunately. And a lot of their differences in their falling out stems from their differences in academic ability and their aspirations. Whether it be because she knows she's not going to do well academically, or she's seen how society treats women like her, Geena doesn't seem to have a lot of aspirations outside of high school. It looks pretty bleak for her. Whereas Crystal, like she seems to have a future because she's focused so much on academics, and that's come at a cost for her, a personal cost for her apparently. And at one point, like this is too much for them to bear, and they can't be friends as a result, which is unfortunate. But they're eventually able to overcome it. However, at the end of the story, we see that friendship isn't really ride or die, because as the graduation ceremony is burning down and the police are closing in, Crystal just runs away. I thought that was very alarming. Like she's willing to abandon this friend, possibly. And I think Geena is willing to let her run away, like possibly because Geena realizes that Crystal has hopes, that she has a future, whereas Geena might not have that future. And so although Crystal notes like a better person would have returned and taken the blame alongside Geena, maybe she realizes that if she does so, she won't succeed in her future academic endeavors. Like her future might be taken away from her. And if the police catch Geena in that moment, if they see her standing next to the burning graduation ceremony, they're going to take her to jail, because even if she's only 17, we've seen how police treat minors, especially black minors, in our society. So there's a very rough sort of thing. Like they rely on each other to get through difficult times, but it's not a ride or die friendship, which is very, very sad. But I like that nuance that Danielle Evans seems to be writing here. Another element of the short story is that of racism. Crystal lives in a still segregated South. The story is set in the year 2000, but it's written in the year 2010. And you would think, oh, well, separate but equal was struck down. Surely, like, school segregation doesn't exist. But Danielle Evans is pointing out that, yes, it still exists, but it's just structurally built into the system, where it's not like, oh, we're separating blacks and whites. You're just rezoning school districts so that like black and white students are separated, so that black students don't get the same opportunities that white students get. And even Crystal is willing to accept that she's kind of an anomaly, that she beat the system by doing well on her standardized test scores. But she notes that like many of her white peers are just able to pay a psychologist to say that they're gifted, and they'll get into honors classes and be able to be in the best part of the school. Because when the school realizes like, oh, we can't do the separate but equal, they create this honor system, which allows you to separate the white students and the black students and the minority students without actually saying that you're doing that. You're just saying, oh, these students just don't do well on the standardized test score. And why is that? Nobody really examines that. But it's because standardized tests are biased, culturally biased. So people of color are doomed to never really do well, and thus they're doomed to never really be in honors classes and get a fair shake at their education. And that's not even to say like there's other elements of racism here as well. The narrator talking about white flight, how the communities are kind of separated in that regard, and so a lot of the funding from for black communities is thrown toward those suburbs that really don't need to exist. And you also have the school names, as I mentioned before, with Robert E. Lee, but the other school that ends up getting in trouble for the vandalism that never happened is named Stonewall Jackson. Both Confederate generals, both fought to preserve a racist system, and you're applying those names to black schools. That seems intentional. And very problematic. And there's an interesting quote about the structural kind of racism that exists there that I want to read to you. I hated her because she tried to talk me out of honors classes and only signed off on my schedule because I threatened to go to the principal. I was an accident. I'd slipped through our school's de facto segregation, and she wasn't happy about it. I had been dealing with people like her since the 3rd grade, when I'd been shipped off to a gifted school as a reward for outsmarting standardized tests. And there you get Crystal kind of realizing that the standardized tests are a way of preserving this segregation, and one of her teachers is trying to talk her out of taking honors classes because that's not what's supposed to happen to the black students. They're supposed to be in one place, and they should know their place, because this teacher, as she mentions later in the story, has a lot of problems with racism, is a very prejudiced teacher, and that's you don't like to see that in school, but that's often the reality for many Southern black individuals, Southern black teenagers who have to deal with this structural racism that takes place. And very fortunately for Crystal, she's able to go to the summer academy and is able to succeed with her future plans because of these opportunities that have been gifted to her, but have not really been aimed at her, because the summer academy, like although she was given that, it was clear that this is an extension of the structural racism, where by saying that you gave it to a black student, you can say that your school isn't racist or anything. Like, oh, we're not racist, we give opportunities all the time, but it's just one opportunity in this case, and when's the next time it's going to be offered to a black student? You probably filled your quota for the next 10 years or something like that. It's really apparent, and I like Danielle Evans for raising awareness of this, but even more so, this was written in 2010, when many people proclaimed we lived in a post-racial America due to the election of Barack Obama, and this stuff is still going on. So it's clear, very clear, that we don't live in this post-racial utopia back in 2010 or even now. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Robert E. Lee is Dead by Danielle Evans, a really superior short story. I really enjoyed reading it, and it had a lot of things worth thinking about that really struck me, and I especially loved the characterization in this story. Getting a real feel for who Crystal and Geena were, and the sad outcome that happened as a result of everything. I think Danielle Evans is a really solid writer, not only with this short story, but with many others in this collection. I definitely urge you to go out and read this and find this if you can. Perhaps it is at your local library. Don't forget to patronize your local library. Otherwise, if you read this before, comment below. Let's have a discussion about Robert E. Lee is Dead. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about this book or this short story or this author if they do not already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and anti-racist travels. Farewell.